Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 13 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Sharks have lost 4-1. So in their third and final game against the Jets this season, trying to close out the season series sweep of Winnipeg, they would be unable to do so. They lose it 4-1, and they only get 4 of a possible 6 points against this team. And this game started off pretty well for the San Jose Sharks. Through the first period, it was actually a rather even game. The Jets started off as the better team through the first few minutes. Then the Sharks kind of began to take over for about a 5-6 minute span. That included the first goal of this game coming from Andrew Cogliano, but then the Jets ended up getting it back a bit near the end of that first period, including their own goal to be able to tie it up from Kyle Connor, and so it was a 1-1 game after 20 minutes. But honestly, as I said, a rather evenly played first period. The Sharks found themselves in a pretty good situation to still be able to close out a victory in this game, but it really began to get away from them in the middle frame. Come second period, the Sharks started off okay, but then as each minute passed, the Jets got better and the Sharks got a lot worse. Eventually, the Jets would actually get 2 goals in the second period, the first one coming from Schmidt and then the second one coming from Harkins, and that one specifically being in the last minute of the second period, which of course is always a killer goal. You don't want to give up a goal late in a period heading into the intermission because it just kind of weighs on you when you're sitting in the locker room. So the Sharks found themselves down by 2 goals, down 3-1 going into the final frame. But if there's anything we learned from the San Jose Sharks thus far this season, is that even when they're down a couple of goals, they're going to sort of push the opposing team to try and be able to tie this game. We've seen it time and time again. Sometimes they've managed to make that comeback and even managed to win the game. Sometimes they get just to within 1 goal and unable to close it out, but there's always some sort of effort there. At least there was always some sort of effort there, because here tonight it was just an awful performance in the third period for the San Jose Sharks. One of their worst periods, in my opinion, of the entire season thus far. It was just the Sharks could not go 5 seconds without giving the puck away. The amount of failed zone exits that they had in this third period was honestly just astonishing. It felt as though the Sharks were not down 3-1 in this third period. It looked like they were up like 10-0 and couldn't care less about managing the puck because it just seemed like such an easy win to just close it out. But it was the Sharks trailing. You would think they'd get some actual decent chances, but besides in the last 2 minutes where the Sharks ended up going 6-on-5 and at least had some offensive zone time, though it would end up leading to a Pierre-Luc Dubois empty netter that would put this game away. Through the first 18 minutes of this third period, it was honestly just embarrassing to watch. This was the first time this season that I felt like turning off the game because it was just so hard to watch the Sharks flounder about in this third period. They looked like an AHL inexperienced team, basically the performance that you would have expected from a Sharks team coming in with 7 Barracuda players. But it's not what we had been seeing in the previous 5 games. Like, this was a complete surprise. I was taken aback by how awful the Sharks looked, and hopefully we don't see them look that bad in another game this season, because again, if you didn't watch this game, it was bad. Moving on to the things to talk about. Normally, I would be outlining basically every player on the roster. Here tonight, I'm not going to do that, mostly because I want to specifically focus on the players who have stepped in over these past 6 games from the Barracuda and see which ones actually deserve to remain in a potential lineup spot come Saturday against the Colorado Avalanche, where all of the Sharks players who have missed the last 6 games, Meyer, or not technically Meyer, but like Carlson, Middleton, Vlasic, Shemek, when they're all expected to return to the lineup. But before I get into that, there is a few things I do want to mention. First would be the special teams. I can't actually talk about the Sharks power play tonight because they got none, and certainly not for a lack of penalties taken by the Jets. In fact, this was an extremely chippy game where you could have expected a lot more penalties than ended up getting called. The Jets got called for 0, and yet there were multiple interference and especially tripping plays that occurred in this game that just go completely uncalled on both sides. I don't exactly know what ended up happening. The Jets themselves got 3 power plays in this one, 2 of them delay of games, so only 1 real stick infraction penalty in this one, which was a trip on Nick Bonino. Again, I'm not entirely sure what happens, but I'm not going to really focus on the referees. The other special teams that I do want to talk about would be the Sharks' penalty kill here tonight, which was once again very impressive. The Sharks came into tonight's game second in the league with an over 90% penalty kill. The Sharks have just been so good in this particular area, so aggressive. They've even at times on penalty kills been getting more shorthanded chances than the opposing team has been getting power play opportunities. So definitely looking very good in this regard, and it's definitely a key part in trying to win games throughout the regular season. If you're giving up a lot of power play goals, which at times, during certain games, referees, especially in the regular season, can be calling 4 or 5 power plays. Not here tonight, because the referees decided not to use their new whistles. Not here tonight, but most nights you'll see a good chunk of power plays, and if you can prevent the other team from scoring on the majority of those, if not all of them, you put yourself in a great position to win more games than not. A couple players who I want to talk about. Brent Burns would be the first one. He continues his point streak here tonight by getting an assist on this Andrew Cogliano goal. It's actually a very nice assist. There's been a lot of talk around Brent Burns thus far this season, and that this could be a potential Norris run for him, like he did back in 16-17 when he won his first and only, so far, Norris Trophy. And at the age of 36, he definitely has the storyline that could go with it. And of course, the two biggest things, at least that I find for Norris voters, is points, which Brent Burns has a lot of them, almost a point per game player thus far this season, as well as time on ice, which of course Brent Burns is right up there near the top in the entire league. Do I think Brent Burns should be winning the James Norris? At least not at this point. There have just been a handful of games thus far this season where he's been a complete defensive liability, so while he's been much, much better in the past few games, I can't really overlook those just yet. Once we get to 30 games into the season, if those games still end up remaining as the only real issues for Brent Burns, then they kind of get diluted out, and you can say, well, generally it's been a great season for Brent Burns, but right now, only 13 games in, I can't really say that much. And the other thing I want to talk about is this disaster of a first line for the San Jose Sharks. I called it out a couple games ago when these three players came together. I called it out last game that while it was slightly better defensively, it was still just a train wreck offensively. Here tonight, it reverted back to where we saw them against the Devils. It was bad defensively. It was bad offensively. And I don't know who is getting paid money to put these three players together. It's actually just completely awful to watch these three players. I can't even say work in tandem with each other, because they're not working at all well together. And I don't want to say this is all Nick Bonino's fault, but there's got to be some sort of correlation between the fact, when you look at Couture and Dahlin, who had been so good, two of the best Sharks players for the first 7 or 8 games of this season, and then were still pretty good when they were on a line with William Eklund, and then suddenly in these past 3 games on a line with Nick Bonino, they've just been like AHL level players. It's actually just been completely awful to watch. If Meier doesn't end up back on this first line, first thing on Saturday with Couture and Dahlin, someone should get fired for making a decision like that, because it's just been completely awful, garbage, terrible to watch. Thank God the players are getting healthy for that game on Saturday. Now, moving on to the players who have stepped in from the Barracuda to the main team over these past 6 games to talk about which ones can retain a spot in the lineup. The first and most obvious one would, of course, be Nick Merkley, who actually got rewarded once again in this game, not only with a couple of shifts on the first line, but also was one of the players on the ice for the 6-on-5 to try and tie up this game at the end of the third period. So clearly the Sharks coaching staff really likes what Nick Merkley has brought to the table for the Sharks. He, of course, actually played a pretty decent role in that only goal the Sharks scored in this game, which was Andrew Cogliano's back in the first period. So when Meier and LeBanc return to the lineup, Nick Merkley will, I would put 99.9% chance, will retain a spot in the lineup with them. It's really on the fourth line where we'll see a couple of players get swapped out. Would it be Gadjevich and Peterson? Would it be Gadjevich and Leonard? Peterson and Leonard? In my opinion, I feel as though the player who has done the most to be able to retain a spot in the lineup would be John Leonard. I've been quite impressed with Leonard's performance over these past few games, so I think he has done just enough to be able to keep a spot on that fourth line, at least for the time being, because honestly, while Meier and LeBanc, who are returning from COVID protocol, definitely will get a spot back in the lineup, the other forward who is returning, Matt Nieto, I don't think he's did enough when he was healthy to show that he deserves to immediately jump back into the lineup, and I think Leonard's been good enough, at least as of late, to be able to keep a spot. When it comes to Peterson and Gadjevich, they certainly haven't been bad. Gadjevich Rajovic in particular, I feel as though hasn't really had that bad of a game with the Sharks thus far this season, but he also hasn't necessarily stood out in such a positive manner, and Peterson has been wildly inconsistent thus far this season, so I think Meyer will end up going back to the first line with Couture and Dahlen. Balcers, Hurdle, and Barabanov will likely stay together. Bonino will take his spot back on the third line with Merkley, and then will be joined by Kevin Labanc. And the fourth line will end up as Weatherby, Cogliano, and John Leonard. On the defensive side, maybe a bit more interesting to discuss about because it'll be Middleton, Carlson, Shemek, and Vlasic who will be healthy and able to return to the lineup. Will any of these four Sharks defenders in the bottom four actually be able to retain a spot? Well, it is technically possible. Let's start with the players who I feel as though have zero chance. The first would, of course, be Nick Milosh. He has done essentially nothing that has been remotely impressive through these 6 games. In particular, just the past couple of games, he's been awful, probably the worst defender for the San Jose Sharks in these past 2 games, and he's shown nothing that has been actually somewhat even remotely better than what Middleton, Vlasic, or Shemek have brought through the first 2 games of the season, and you don't really have to do a ton to be regarded at least better than a player like Shemek or Vlasic were in the first 8 games, and so Milosh will absolutely be returning to the Barracuda come Saturday. The other player who I don't think has much of a chance would be Santeri Hatakka. It's kind of a weird situation because personally I've watched him through the 5 games he played. He was injured during one of them, and besides one game where I thought he looked really good, I felt as though at best he's looked slightly above average and at worst he's looked quite bad like he has in these past couple of games, and yet there have been a contingent of Sharks fans who seem to think Hatakka has done no wrong in this stretch of games and deserves to find himself on the third pairing come Saturday. I definitely don't agree with that. I think Hatakka could definitely use some time in the AHL. Hopefully, once everybody's healthy, he's not going to be kept up with the Sharks like he was at the start of the season as the 7th defenseman, because I do think the Sharks have found a much better 7th defenseman, but I'll get to that a bit later. The 2 players who I think have a chance to be able to find themselves in the lineup come Saturday would be Merkley and Megna. First, I want to talk about Ryan Merkley, who was once again one of the best players for the San Jose Sharks here tonight against the Jets and a couple nights ago against the Calgary Flames. Merkley was probably a top 3 player for the San Jose Sharks. It's been very impressive to watch his development in such a short period of time, because back in the first couple of games when he stepped into the Sharks, he just looked completely lost. He looked like a player playing his first 2 NHL games, which he was, but now here just in games 5 and 6, when you'd think you wouldn't really expect that much development, Ryan Merkley has looked so much better, and it felt as though he was rewarded a lot for this development late in this game with a pretty hefty amount of ice time in the third period. So honestly, if it were up to me and in the perfect world that I'm living in, I do think Ryan Merkley has done enough to be able to retain a spot in the lineup come Saturday, but we know how Bob Booner is with these younger players. He doesn't necessarily have a ton of trust in them, and of course, considering Bob Booner was not actually the coach for tonight or for any of the games that Ryan Merkley has played, he's probably going to end up going just back with Vlasic and Shemek, or at least not choosing Ryan Merkley as the option, and we'll see him back at the AHL. But it should be noted, like I said in the previous video, this development time has been valuable for Ryan Merkley, and he will definitely be back stronger come next season. The player who I think has the highest chance to be able to retain a spot in the lineup come Saturday would be Megna. He's much older, he's much more experienced, at least than the other 3 players here, even if he hasn't had a ton of NHL experience through his career. And he's been a solid, consistent defensive force for the San Jose Sharks over this short period of games. So if Bob Booner has the feeling that a player like Shemek or Vlasic or even Middleton might be coming in a bit cold, it wouldn't surprise me if Megna finds himself on the third pairing come Saturday. It's kind of like a 50-50 at this point. I could see it happening, I could see it not happening, but I feel as though Megna actually has just a slightly better chance with than Merkley, even though I think, all in all, Merkley has been the best of these 4 defensemen over that 6-game stretch. And then I'll finally talk about the goaltender here tonight for the Sharks, James Reimer, who I thought performed quite admirably here tonight. Yes, he did let in 3 goals, but he had absolutely zero chance on the Connor goal or the Harkins goal. Both of those were just massive defensive mistakes. Nick Bonino just not being able to cover Connor sufficiently on that first one, and then Nick Milosh not being able to block the pass on that 2-on-1 for Harkins. You could say he had a chance on the Nate Schmidt goal. I didn't really watch this one enough to see if it actually deflected off of a Sharks player or not on its way to the net. Even even if it was a bad goal from James Reimer, he's been so good that thus far this season that it is much more excusable. So I think Reimer definitely gave the Sharks a chance to win here tonight, but it was much more the fault of the 18 players in front of him why the Sharks did not end up getting even a single point here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday where they would take on the Colorado Avalanche, which if I told you this last year, you would be shaking in your boots because the Colorado Avalanche were one of the best teams in the league last season. But here, this year, it's been a very rough start for the Avalanche, and now with Nathan MacKinnon injured, they could be particularly vulnerable, so we'll see if the Sharks can take advantage of that Avalanche team. Class dismissed.